childhood. How'd you grow up? What was it like being you as a
Well, I
child?
grew up on a turkey farm in Ohio. My journey began when I was around 5. I'd gone to bed. My mother and my father, I couldn't remember, put me to bed. And as soon as they closed the door to my bedroom, it went dark, and next thing I knew, I was a ball of light going out my bedroom window. That's what I remember, being that ball of light going out the bedroom window. And then the next thing I remember is I would all of a sudden, in a car, my father's car, my parents' car. My brother was sitting on my right side, my dad was sitting on my left driving, and I was wrapped in a blanket, and the heater was on because it was in the winter, and they were rushing me to the hospital. And I don't know how I got there or anything. And then I find myself in the hospital, and the doctor's checking my eyes out, trying to figure out what's wrong with me. And I don't know, my dad's all freaked out, trying to figure out what happened. The doctor can't figure anything out. So finally, they take me back home, and they tell me what happened. My mother came in to check on me, and she walked in the room, and I'm on the bed with my legs and my arms stiff as a board, straight as a board, with a huge smile on my face. And just still. And they didn't know what was happening. They tried to wake me up, they couldn't wake me up. They wrapped me in a blanket. I'm not kicking or like a convulsion or anything. I was just stiff as a board with a huge smile on my face, and my eyes rolled back in the back of my head. And they tried to get me out of it. I wouldn't move, so they wrapped me in a blanket. This is how the story was told to me. They wrapped me in a blanket to get me to the hospital, and even in the process, they said they banged my head on the door jamb, and they were all freaked out trying to get me out of the house. And I wasn't moving. Even when they put me in the car, it was like putting a board in a car. I wouldn't move. I was just stiff. And from that time on, I was weird. I, the sky I'd talk to the sky, and I could see what I called halos at that time, because they weren't auras. I didn't know what an aura was, but I knew in the Bible people had halos, but I was seeing them around plants, and I was seeing them around people, and I knew what people were thinking, and I was always felt that there was something somebody wasn't telling me, right? There was something that was about myself that I couldn't explain, and I was always small for my age, and to get through grade school, I wouldn't pay attention to school. I didn't really have much patience for it. And in grade school, I would sit there and hold my hands over my eyes. I guess I was being guided or whatever. I'd hold my hands over my eyes and hold my hands on my eyelids, and all of a sudden I'd start seeing colors. And as soon as I started seeing the colors, I'd jump into the colors. And it was like I did that through grade school, and I was always getting in trouble for daydreaming and all this stuff, but I graduated and I was still able to function, but I was always my friends' counselors, and I always had a wisdom that I didn't know where it came from. But that was my journey as a child, and then later on, when I moved from Ohio and I went to California, my journey took on it opened up into a whole new world. And that world included the crystals and the stones that I collected. But also I had a opportunity to study with and I'm around 20 years old, so it's not technically my childhood, but I still was a young adult. And when I moved to California, the first people I was able to meet was person I met was Larry Goldsmith, and he was a med student at Stanford University. My brother was going to Stanford at the time. and he was a third or fourth generation San Francisco family, and he helped start some centers at that time. Tassajara, which was a human potential center where Fritz Perls and Ida Rolf and Lily, who did study with the dolphins and sensory deprivation tanks and all that, started in Esalen, and also the Tassajara Zen Center. He worked with the Zen master and at that time, and he taught me yoga and meditation and all these things. And as soon as those things started happening in me, then I became more aware and more conscious of those of the crystals and what they meant and how they interacted and spoke to me at that time. Also, during that time, I was given a place to live up in the mountains. It was a beautiful, beautiful location. It was in the Santa Cruz Mountains, north of Palo Alto in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it was off the grid. Everything was off the grid, and it was called The Land. And The Land was originally started by the Institute of Nonviolence, which was started by Joan Baez. Joan Baez was a well-known, and still is, a well-known activist and folk singer, was a personal friend of, and a very close friend to Bob Dylan, and she started the Institute of Nonviolence, and the man who discovered or patented the first videotape, owned that patent, gave 768 acres to the Institute of Nonviolence, and people who were part of the Institute built their homes, but they were domes and teepees and tree houses and you know, on the land. They built the homes, but they were all built out of love and out of recycled things that were, you know, good lumber and things like that, but things that they reused and built these homes, and they lived on the land. And when you left the land, you didn't own the home because it was part of the nonviolence or the institute. It was a nonprofit, and people would leave it, but before they would leave, it was like a commune. There was a main house, which was where the farm was for the land, and a barn. And in the barn was a large barn where people who were craftsmen had their workshops and things in the barn, or where we would have our meetings. And the people on the land who lived in the tree houses and the teepees and the school buses and the domes, the geodesic domes and things that they built, whenever they would want to leave, it was agreed that whoever they passed it on to, the rest of the community would agree to, yes, this is the right person, and we allow them to come on, and you were vetted more or less. Well, at that time I was a baker in Palo Alto, a place called the Whole Earth Bakery on University Avenue. And Whole Earth Bakery was started by a guy named, what was his name? I'm trying to think of it. Anyway, he was the first one to study the Essene Bible and produce sprouted wheat bread.
The Ezekiel.
Yeah,
bread.
Then it was called Essene bread. It was Manny Friedman, that was his name.
Okay.
And he was the first one to do it was called Essene bread because it came from the Essenes, where they took and it came from the Essene Bible. And he was the first one to develop the Essene bread. And I was a baker at that time, and I was also a cook. I was a soup cook, and I was working in the bakery, and I was making the Essene bread, and it was also another woman who was there named Sylvia would come down like once every couple of weeks, and she would work. And Sylvia was she lived on wild foods. She was very, 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 she was an herbalist. She's very knowledgeable. I guess she'd probably be in her mid to late 20s at that time. And she came down from the land. That's where she was coming from. I didn't know it then. then she told me one day she was a good friend, and she said one day I'm going to be moving. I'm going to be going to Boston. I'm going to study with Michio Kushi, who is a Japanese master in macrobiotic teaching. And she goes, I'm leaving, I'm going to Boston, and I'm going to be leaving my home, and it's on the land, and I want to give you my home. Well, I had no idea what her home was. But to get to her house, once you were on the land, you had to walk about 1.5 miles on they were just deer trails or cow trails around the foothills of these golden, beautiful hills with live oaks, and from the house, the farmhouse, and the barn to where the home was about 1.5 miles. And no roads, just pathways. So she invites me up to meet the community. I go up there and I find her home, and I go down into from the foothills into this ravine where there's redwoods and madrone and manzanilla, and these are trees that grew there, bay trees, and it goes down into a gully. And on the gully, right before you get to the bottom of the gully, at the bottom of the gully actually, there's a stream, a mountain stream that comes down. And I come up to this bridge. It's a hand-built bridge that looks like a Japanese bridge, and it goes over onto an island. And the island's in the middle of this mountain stream, where the mountain stream comes down and divides. And the island's big enough that it has its own redwood trees on it. In the middle of the island is this octagon home. And it was about 25 feet in diameter. And it had an octagon roof with clear octagon panels and windows all the way around, and a platform and a potbelly stove. And that was the home. And it was a temple. It was a beautiful, beautiful spot. In fact, the madrone tree that was growing next to it. Now, if you go and you look up what madrone, it's a beautiful, beautiful tree that when the bark comes off, it feels like skin. It's a peach color, and it's absolutely smooth. Like when you take a tree and you take the bark off, and behind it is where the bark laid against, just smooth.
Yeah.
Well, imagine that being like that, with like paper-like bark that grows on the outside, only it's a peach color.
Wow.
Well, when they built the octagon home, it was all out of redwood. There was this beautiful madrone there, but the branch was where they wanted to put the octagon, so they built the dome, the roof and the side of the octagon, so the branch came into the inside the octagon room. And that was mine. She gave it to me. Wow. As a place to live. And it had no running water, no electricity. You're 1.5 miles from any of that. And a potbelly stove and a little slide door that you got in. And my time up there was being able to live there, and I was accepted by the community. And so I lived there, and it took me into a place inside myself that I could never have. It's something you can't buy, because I was alone. You weren't anywhere near anybody. There were people there, but they might be like 1/4 mile away, or not within distance where you would ever be bothered or anything by other people who lived in other parts of the land. And I had an awakening. I had an awareness that came to me that put everything together as to what I experienced when I was a child. And also I had this is another part of my journey that will take more time to explain, but to make a long story short, there was a place that we went to that was near there, and it was on the Santa Cruz coast, on the coast, the west coast of California, on the ocean, where to get there you had to go down a 400-foot cliff. And anyway, I had a non-terrestrial experience. I had a Palladian ship land, I had an interaction, I had a world open up to me that I'll never be the same from. And that was the beginning of my journey, from the things that I experienced, that I learned. I was meditating and learning to chant and learning to understand myself in a spiritual way, that opened up all those things that were happened to me in childhood, and all the things that happened to me when I was in California, all came together. And it was like opening up like a flower. Next thing I know, you know, my reality was all about spirituality. It was about learning about consciousness, learning more about myself as an individual, and what I had to bring to the world, what I had to give to the world. And then from then on, the people I met and the people I was connected to were monumental and amazing teachers that were friends, and it was just like the whole thing just kept opening up and opening up and opening